Good afternoon and welcome to our APAP ArtsForward Study webinar. We're delighted to be with you this afternoon. I'm Steve Wolf, Principal of AMS Planning and Research, coming to you today from Southport, Connecticut, the ancestral lands of the Pequannock. We honor their elders past and present and their stewardship of the land. I'm joined today by my colleague, Christian Otten.
Hi everyone, my name is Christian Otten. I'm calling you from Newtown, Connecticut, the ancestral lands of the Pequannock tribe.
We're excited to be with you here today. And just to complete my intro, I'm a middle-aged white man with graying hair, glasses, and today I'm wearing a blue and white shirt. We just want to give you a brief reminder of the methodology of our survey, and then we'll dive into the body of the presentation. Christian, if you want to go ahead and share the slides, thanks very much. So as I mentioned, this is the third report on the Venues and Presenters Survey, which one of two surveys that are happening under the ArtsForward program with the support of the Mellon Foundation. In this particular survey, we had about 150 respondents from all over the United States. Slightly more than half of our respondents had budgets of less than $1 million, with just about a third in the $1 million to $5 million category. So really, really important that we have a good distribution. We also have a broad geographic distribution, big distribution by kind of community, urban setting, suburban or rural. What has been fairly consistent though is the kind of organization. The vast majority of the organizations that we're hearing from, a little over 75% are presenters that have venues. We have a good cohort of presenters without venues, about 20% of the sample, and then small numbers of other types of preventers. Christian's going to dive into some activity and attendance data, and then we'll come back after that with some information about the workforce and health and safety conditions.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We do want to talk a little bit about activity and attendance and where we stand on that front. We are seeing that growth in activity continues, and particularly in full capacity activity relative to April, when 71% of organizations were hosting full capacity performances. Now, as of June, we're seeing about 8 in 10 that are hosting full capacity performances, whereas there's another 14% that expect to defer that type of activity to the fall. Again, activity is growing at a metered pace. And while we see it kind of sit right here at this level of a reduction of about 20 or 30% relative to pre-pandemic activity, we still feel that this is promising because we've seen growth since April, and also there's a reduction in the number of presenters and venues that are offering less than 10 in-person performances per 30-day period relative to April. So in the last 30 days, we've seen 46% that offered less than 10 performances in the last 30 days relative to April's 53%. We're still observing that the presenters that control venues are able to remain most active, presumably due to their control of venues. So a lot more of them have been able to remain relatively active or increase their activity versus presenters that do not control venues. And similarly, we're seeing that regions outside of the Northeast have increased activity relative to those that operate within the Northeast. So there's still a pretty significant reduction in activity over the last 30 days in the Northeast relative to other regions. We wanted to ask presenters a little bit more about their relationship with risk in all the forms that risk takes, and we heard a number of things from them. We're observing that they're planning smaller seasons, shorter seasons, scaling things down to some degree. They're identifying programs that have significant market appeal and going after those sort of things primarily. And that includes an expansion of Broadway content and popular content. Definitely an interesting conversation to be having with the artists and the agents on this side of the study. Very careful consideration as to whether to remove or implement health safety protocols, as you'll see later on, or I want to make mention of the fact that we're seeing that most have reduced or completely eliminated their health safety protocols at the moment. but many mentioned that they're carefully considering those protocols, whether to put them in place or not, and the impact that that has on their operations. We're seeing reduced artist fee offerings. We're seeing and hearing from you all that you're seeking artists that have funding, that come with funding and can support themselves to some degree. And we're also seeing a really interesting trend in presenters doing less presenting and using venues for more rental activity. An encouraging statistic here, we're seeing that 97% are booking for the future, and most of them are booking for what is essentially the immediate term for June, July, August, September, whereas about a third are booking for the earliest date that they're booking for is in the fall. When we look at subscriptions, we're seeing growth relative to April. An encouraging stat that their sales of subscriptions among presenters is increased. We've got about 70% that say they're still behind, so there's definitely room to grow here. But as of June, we're up to 30% that claim that they were selling their subscriptions ahead of their last full season before the pandemic, relative to the same period of time in terms of sales duration. And then again, I would just want to make note of many of the different regional differences that we see in the South and the Midwest and the West in particular, where subscription sales are less behind. When we look at single ticket sales, we're also seeing, while we have lots of room to grow here, and a significant number are still behind their pre-pandemic levels of ticket sales, not surprisingly, we are seeing growth here, and that's encouraging. Many are, nearly 70% are reporting that they're behind, but there's continuing improvement from April, which is encouraging to us. When we look at the average percentage of capacity sold, we're seeing that about 3 in 4 are selling under 60% of capacity. The average percent of capacity sold across all venues in the current season to date is just over 50%. 55% of seats have been sold to date by aggregate across the season. We're also seeing that drop counts, which represent the number of ticket buyers that attend or do not attend. When a drop count is lower, that means that fewer ticket buyers are attending. And we're seeing that those lower drop counts are improving. Their lower drop count is a little bit confusing. I just want to make sure I clarify this. When fewer ticket buyers are attending, your drop count is lower. So we're seeing that drop counts overall are improving. They're staying about the same, or they're higher for more in this period relative to April. But there's still a long way to go here as well. And we see quite a bit of regionality among those lower drop counts. When we look at non-ticketed activity, we're seeing an overall reduction in non-ticketed activity relative to some of the other periods of the study earlier on in the first and second quarter of 2022. And that's presumably due to the fact that there's more activity going on that is ticketed, and that's taking up a lot of the time on the calendar and space in terms of organizational operation. So that's an encouraging situation as well overall.
I do think, Christian, right, that we want to point out for folks that the really significant decline in online content, which is reduced by about half.
Absolutely. We also asked many presenters and venues in the study to talk to us a little bit about their relationship with advocacy for social or political issues. And many came back to us saying that they are either engaging in a conversation around these issues with no position, or they do not touch the issue at all. Many are dealing with navigating different funding structures that would prohibit them from doing so, or reporting relationships, or even just navigating patron sentiments. And they tend to avoid it or abstain from taking a political position, even though they may serve as a forum for the any given issue in terms of a conversation. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Stephen to talk a little bit more about workforce and the status there.
Thanks, Christian. Equally important as our audience is returning and programming on our stage is what's happening with the people who make up our workforce. We've been tracking a variety of different metrics here and have talked about them some before. What's interesting here as we get through the June data, pretty much everybody's back to work on the full-time size, 96, 97% it was in April. And working regular hours as compared to the hours they were working prior to the pandemic. Where we've seen the gain is an increase of part-time staff, with now roughly 86% reported to be working their expected number of hours or their comparative number of hours before the pandemic, which is up from 73%. So actually up fully 10% or 7 points. But 12% of the part-time workforce are still working reduced hours, and as Christian mentioned at the top of the data, that's because in many cases activity has not reached pre-pandemic levels. It's an interesting economic conundrum, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later, because we've got all of our full-time staff back and not all of our activity back, and that has certain implications. As we go forward and we look at the data regionally, we see on the full-time side, it's pretty consistent across the country and in different kinds of geographies. We see a little bit of regional difference with fewer part-timers working regular hours in the South and the West, and fewer part-timers working in rural settings. Again, we think that there's probably a correlation to the level of activity, but we really don't have the data to document that. When we look at the demographic composition, of the workforce, the organizations who responded to the survey, about half reported to us that it's pretty much unchanged. The other half were divided by the single largest group of folks who indicate that their workforces are younger than they were or more racially diverse. The other thing that we've heard that is really, really interesting and documented through the survey is that there's been a significant reduction in the tenure or time in the workforce of folks that have hired. From other research that we've been doing, we know that in larger presenting organizations with venues, that upwards of 60% of the folks who have been hired since January are either new to their role or new to their organization. And that no doubt creates some challenges and stress internally that I expect we'll talk about later. With that, I'm going to turn it over to, oops, sorry, and almost skipped a question there. We asked leaders what they're most concerned about in terms of the workforce returning, and we had really significant concerns previously about the supply of the workforce, work-life balance questions, compensation issues, people leaving the sector for other employment. While still about 1 in 3 organizations are concerned about those categories, it's come down from about 1 in 2. So people seem to be settling in with their staffing as people return and are getting more focused on getting the work done. With that, I'll turn it back over to Christian to talk a little bit about health and safety factors before we wrap up.
Thanks, Stephen. So on the health and safety front, we're seeing audiences in particular, as we are combining our work here with our Audience Outlook Monitor study, we're recognizing that the expectation among audiences for masking is dropping. While it's still about half that expect to walk into a theater and have a mask mandate, overall, there's a significant level of regionality to that. But overall, we're seeing that those expectations are dropping. Similarly, we're seeing a leveling out of those that expect or would be encouraged by a vaccinated only admittance policy. we're at about half that say they would be more likely to attend with a policy, and 10% now, as of June, are saying that they would only attend given this policy. Similarly, we're seeing, while the concerns are still maintained, they are dropping relatively speaking among audiences. Less are very concerned about the safety of gathering in large numbers. Less are concerned about the duration of their immunity from the vaccine or their booster. Less are concerned about the vulnerability to a breakthrough infection, and less are concerned overall that they could transmit the virus. We'll be curious to see how that might shift as we're collecting data that's in the field right now, given the prevalence of BA5. But I think this is an important trend overall, that audiences are feeling more ready relative to what was occurring in March. So all that being said, our observation among the presenters is that nearly all of you have dropped mask mandates, have dropped proof of vaccination policies. We're really sitting at only about 10% of presenters now and venues that are employing those sorts of policies among other types of policies. Meanwhile, audiences still expect some of those things. So it'll be an interesting thing to observe as things wax and wane, I suppose. I don't know if there's anything you want to weigh in here, Stephen, but just a really interesting status at the moment and a snapshot of where we are.
Yeah, we know we have some regional differences, right, Christian, that we're still seeing, and I think as we shift from pandemic to endemic, figuring out how to manage this as a course of ordinary business is there. I think one of the things we're hearing is, well, we may not have the policy. We invite you. We're hearing a lot of, please feel comfortable, please feel free to use your mask if you'd like, or so on.
Absolutely. So some other tangential elements here. We have been hearing a little bit about intermission policies, but overall, many of you are saying that at least some, if not all of your performances are offering intermissions where patrons may not be sitting in a seat or physically separated by de facto. But nearly 9 in 10 are offering intermissions and feel confident there. So overall, when we take a look at the continuing recovery and the status of health and safety in the perspective of audiences, we're seeing activity grow slightly, but there's still room and there's still essentially a long runway for recovery in terms of activity and operations. But it is promising what we're seeing in terms of sales. Subscriptions and single ticket sales are improving. That said, there is a risk adversity that we're experiencing and we're hearing from many presenters. And I think it's important to also call out that many of the presenters have dropped their health and safety protocols in conjunction or in juxtaposition perhaps with the expectations of arts audiences. Even though they're leveling, we're still seeing about half of arts audiences are expecting these policies to be in place. So,
and I don't know quite how you did it today, Christian, but you've got me being the be cautious guy. I think when we look at this across the arc, right, we see at the top of the data that while activity is increasing, the point you made about still being below pre-pandemic levels, and in fact, significantly below those levels. Excuse me.
God bless you.
Gesundheit, or whatever. While single ticket sales and subscription sales are improving, we know from other data sources that there's a significant percentage of the audience that hasn't yet made plans to return and has not returned. And so figuring out how to backfill that audience is going to be an important part. And it's a really interesting challenge when you become risk adverse, right? How do you bring new people to the system if you're trying to go with the things that you see as tried and true? But in general, the picture is much more positive than it was 2 months ago, continuing to improve. We're beginning to figure out what the new normal is. It's not a return to what we knew before the pandemic, but we're beginning, I think, to get an understanding. Any closing thoughts on your end?
No, I think I concur. It's a very it's a relatively encouraging picture. I think there's a lot of work to be done as we look forward, but I think that we're on the right path. I mean, the other thing I might add that we're seeing among our audiences, and kudos to many of you, is that they're quite pleased with, and consistently over time have been pleased with the way that you're communicating. So I think it's really important that the field continue, and particularly venues and presenters continue to communicate with their audiences about what the status of things are, as certainly conditions are shifting. And I think that's been a really, really important method of maintaining contact and building business in essence.
Oh, with that note, let's go to the end. We're going to be joined by several panelists now to address some interesting questions based on the data. So Christian, we'll turn it back over, I guess, to Krista.
Great.